Welcome to this YSL Report Builder tutorial. In this video we'll cover how to use multi-value parameters and null values. We'll start by creating a basic multi-value parameter and then explain the problem with allowing null values in that type of parameter. We'll then explain how you can substitute nulls with an alternative value, how to use the ISNULL function in SQL to test for those alternative values, and then how to include those null substitutes in your available value lists. So let's get started. Here's an idea of the type of thing we'll aim to create in the video. This report shows a list of actors, and we can choose which actors we want to see by selecting their family name and year of birth from these two drop-down list parameters. I've set both parameters to allow multiple values, and I've also added an option for null to the list. So if I remove all of the selections first of all, and then check the box for null, and then also include a couple of actual actor surnames, when I click View Report, it shows a combination of actors with the selected names, and also those actors with a null in the family name column. I've got a similar system for the year of birth. I can select all of the family names, and then for the year of birth, I can select, first of all, I'll unselect all the options and then select this unknown year, and then click View Report, and that shows me a list of actors with a null in the date of birth column. Again, one more similar example that we'll look at a bit later on in the video. This report shows a list of films and the country that the film was made in, and we can select the countries we want to choose from this drop-down list at the top. It's possible that in the database there are some films that have been added to the list which don't have a country assigned to them yet, and I've got an option there to include the null countries, and if I do that I'll see that name should float to the top of the list. It seemed an appropriate film name to pick for the example I'm demonstrating here. Sorry for the terrible joke, but there we go. So that's what we'll aim to create. If you'd like to follow along, you will need a copy of the YSL Movies database, so just another quick reminder that this video shows you how to get it set up, and there's a link in that video's description that you can use to download the script file you'll need. If you've done that already, I've got a blank report waiting for me in Report Builder, and the first thing I'll do in here is right-click on the Data Sources folder and choose Add Data Source. I'll call this one Movies, and then I'll use an embedded connection pointing to a Microsoft SQL server, and then click the Build button to get some help with the connection string. I'll type in a full stop and a backslash as a shortcut to the local host, and then the name of the instance of SQL Server I'm using, SQL 2017. I will then select my movies database from the drop-down list, and then click OK a couple of times to get my data source created. The first example we'll have a go at is based on the actor table. So let's right click on the movies data source and choose Add Dataset. And I'll call this dataset Actors. If I can spell actors, that would help. There we go. And then I can click the Query Designer button so I can simply pick the columns from the actor table that I need. I will go for the first name and the family name and the DOB, short for date of birth column. Having done that, I can click OK a couple of times. And then I can display those actors in a table in the report. So let's tidy up. I'll remove my page footer first. Then I'll get rid of this placeholder title text box. Then I can right click into the report body and choose to insert a table. And then assign those three fields, the first name, family name, and DOB. Just change some column widths to hopefully make things a little easier to read. And then some very basic formatting as well. I want to first of all make sure I will see all of the text in the table. So I'm going to highlight all the cells and then switch away from the default font and then back to the default font to avoid the font rendering bug you might have encountered. Certainly you will have seen it in earlier videos if you've watched other videos in this playlist. And then I'll also format the date of birth as a date and do some very basic colouring in for the header row to make that stand out, and then run the report just to make sure it returns some sensible results. Next, I'd like to create a multi-value parameter which allows me to type in a list of family names and then filter this table to show the matching entries. To do that, I can head back to the design view, and we've got a couple of choices here, as always. We could create a report parameter first, and then assign a filter to either the dataset or to the table in the report. Alternatively, we could create a query parameter by modifying the select statement that populates the actors dataset. The query parameter will automatically create the corresponding report parameter. Query parameters are usually better because they filter the data at the source, so at the SQL Server side, the data is filtered out before it's returned into the report. Whereas with the report parameter and the filter, all the data is returned to the report first, and then the results are filtered out. So you may have more network traffic than you need if you use report parameters and filters. So let's add a query parameter by right-clicking the actors dataset and choose dataset properties. And then I'll click at the end of my select statement, and then I'll just zoom in so you can hopefully see this a little more clearly. I can add a where clause, and I want to check where the family name, and I know that I'm going to create a multi-value parameter. So I'm going to use the in operator and then enclose the parameter name I'm about to make up in a set of round brackets. So I'll call this one @famName, just for short. Okay, so having done that, I can click OK. You'll see that the corresponding report parameter gets created at the top in the parameters panel and also in the parameters folder. Just a couple of quick properties to change. If I double click on the parameter, I can modify the prompt so it's a little more readable. I can call it family name. The data type is correct, that's text, and the family name column does indeed contain text. And I just want to make sure that I allow multiple values. Having done that, I can click OK. And then if I run my report, I should find that I can click on this drop-down list and then type in a list of values, separating each one by pressing enter. So if I type in a few common actor surnames like Baldwin and Fox and Harris and, oops, I can't spell Harris, there we go, Harris and Jones and Lee, and those are some good repetitive actor names. If I click the view report button, I'll find a list of actors with matching any of the entries that I've typed in. Now I'd like the option to search for actors with a null in the family name column. Ordinarily, to do that, you'd head back to the design view and then change another property of the parameter by double-clicking on it and then check the box to allow a null value. However, if you try to click OK, you'll spot an immediate problem. You're not allowed to mix and match multi-value parameters with null values in Report Builder, as this message tells you. Even if you could include a null value in that list, it would be a little bit pointless at this stage anyway, simply because of the way our query works with the in operator. Just to demonstrate what I mean by that, if I head over to SQL Server Management Studio, I've written a query that kind of simulates what our dataset query is doing once we've typed in a list of options in our multi-value parameter. So I'm asking to see all the actors where the family name is in this list. If I execute that query, I'll certainly see actors whose surname is Lee and whose surname is Fox, but I don't see any actors whose surname is a null. And that's because the in operator doesn't treat the null in the appropriate way. The in operator is really a bit of syntax sugar to make writing your where clauses a little bit easier. So this is essentially broken out into where the family name equals Lee, or family name equals Fox, or family name equals null. And of course, if you know much about how SQL works, you'll know that you can't say something equals null by default. That never returns any results. What you have to do is say is null instead, and that would return the actors with a null family name. So that's a bit of the background as to why this doesn't work in the first place, but that doesn't solve our problem yet, does it? If I head back to my report builder report, I'll need to click OK first, and then uncheck the allow null box and then click OK. The approach we need to take here to solve this problem is to substitute the null with an actual value that wouldn't ordinarily be found in the family name column. So again, just to explain what I mean by that, I'm going to head back to SQL Server Management Studio. I'm just going to undo a few things to get back to where I was before, back to my in operator with this list of values. Let's imagine I replaced the null here with, let's say, an empty string. I'll type in a pair of single quotes to place an empty string in that list. Then what I'd also need to do is check where the family name, but not the actual family name. I want to substitute any null value in the family name column with an empty string. So I can use the ISNULL function to do this. So I can say ISNULL, open some parentheses, family name, comma, and then type in a pair of single quotes and close the round brackets. So this function will replace any nulls in the family name column with an empty string, and we'll be comparing that with the in operator to see if any family name is now equal to an empty string. So if I execute that, we'll see that we now are indeed returning a combination of Lees and Foxes and people with no family name. So now we just need to replicate that functionality in our report builder report. Let's head back over there. And the first thing I'll do is right click on my actors dataset and choose dataset properties. And then I'm going to modify the where clause to say where is null, open some round brackets, family name, comma, single quotes, and then close the round brackets. So any family name that has a null in it will be substituted with an empty string. What I can then do is click OK. I will now need to allow an empty string for my family name report parameter. So I can double click on family name, and because I'm using a text parameter, I am allowed to use a blank value or an empty string. So I can tick that box to allow a blank value. I can then click OK, and I am allowed to mix and match blank values with multi-value parameters. So that if I now run the report and click on the drop-down arrow, I'll hit enter on the first line to use an empty string, and then let's type in Lee and Fox, two nice short names to type in. Click View Report, and now we're seeing the combination of people with Lee and Fox as a surname and those with no surname at all. Now let's look at populating our drop-down list with some available values to pick from, rather than having to type in the list of entries each time. We can head back to the design view, and then double click on the family name parameter again, and head to the available values page. I'm going to specify some values for this first basic example, and then we'll look at how we can populate that list with a query shortly. I'll add a few entries to the list. Let's add, say, 4 or 5 by clicking the add button 5 times. And then for the first label, now remember that the label does not have to match the value of the field you're testing for. The label is simply what's displayed to the user when they're looking at the report parameters. So for the label, I'm going to make the first one say no family name. Doesn't really matter exactly what it says. The important thing is that the value is just an empty string. So I can select the value in that cell and then just hit the delete key to clear its contents. For the next few, I'll type in some actual real names. So let's go for Baldwin, and I'm just going to copy that and paste it into the value box. And then let's do a couple of others. Let's say Fox, and then Harris. Don't worry, I'm not going to type in the entire list of actor names. Let's go for Jones as well. Okay, so just enough to demonstrate that the principle works. If we now click OK, we can run the report, and now we'll get a list which allows us to choose specifically no family name, but we know that under this, behind the scenes, that's actually returning an empty string, which is being compared to an empty string in the underlying select statement that populates the dataset. But we can happily mix and match this with any other family names that actually do exist to return the list of results we want. Now let's look at how to populate the available values using the list of family names that actually exist in the actor table. In order to do this, we'll write a query to populate a new data set, and just to again demonstrate how that's going to work, I've written another query in SQL Server Management Studio. So currently it's selecting the family name from the actor table in ascending order of family name. So when I execute the query, it returns an entry for each individual actor in the actor table. So that's 1,238 rows. But you'll notice there are quite a lot of duplicates in that list. I've got some nulls, and I've got a couple of Adams, a couple of Afflecks, etc. So the first thing I'd like to do is make sure I only see one row for each different family name. So I can do that by adding the distinct keyword to my query. So select distinct family name, and when I execute the query again, I now see just one entry for each family name. Now I know that I can't allow null values in this drop-down list when I've got a multi-value parameter, so I need to substitute the null for the value my query is testing for. So I'm testing for empty strings. So what I'm going to do here is calculate ISNULL family name, comma, single quotes, close the round brackets, and then I'm going to assign an alias to this so that it says as family name. So when you create a calculated column, if I just run that first, I can't reference sorry, beg pardon, I can't reference the family name column because it technically no longer exists. This is an expression in the select list. So I need to assign an alias to this so that it replicates the original column name. So that now returns a list with all the actor names in alphabetical order, and the first item in the list will be an empty string. And that's actually what the user will see in the drop-down list as well. Seeing a blank empty string there isn't particularly helpful. So as well as having the empty string that the query is going to test for, I'd also like to include a label which replaces the empty string with a more descriptive message like no family name or null family name, something like that. So to do that, I'm just going to copy this first expression, and then on the next line, type in a new comma and paste that in. I'm going to change the alias so that it says family name label, so I can't have two columns with the same name. They've got to be distinct, unique. And then I can change the value that I return if the family name is null to something like no family name or null family name or any other descriptor that you like. So when I execute that query now, I've got no family name sitting at the top of the list and then the alphabetically sorted list of family names. I'm just going to copy all of that code to the clipboard and then head back to my report builder report, head back to the design view. I'm going to right click on my movies data source and choose to add a new data set. I'll call this one family name list and then simply paste in the query I've just copied into the query box. I can click OK, and then I want to use the results of that query to populate the available values of that parameter. So I can double click on the family name parameter, choose available values, this time choose get values from a query, set the dataset to family name list. The value field will be the family name. Remember, that's the one that includes the empty string. And then the label field will be family name label. So I can click OK one more time, run the report, and now I've got a nice convenient way to select any options that I want for the family name. If I choose no family name, that returns all the actors with no family name. And then any other combination of family names I like, I can select a few, click View Report, and they will all appear in the list as well. Just before we move on to the next parameter, I want to give you a quick reminder that you can use those same data sets to set the default values of a parameter. So let's head back to the design view, and I'm going to double click on the family name parameter, head to the default values page, and choose to get values from a query. I'm going to select the family name list dataset and then the family name column for the value field. When I click OK and then run the report, this time the drop-down list will be fully populated with all of the items from the drop-down list, eventually, when it finally loads. There we go. So every option in that list has been checked, including the no family name option. Next, let's create a parameter which will allow us to filter this list based on the year of the actor's birth. This is a little trickier for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because we have to extract the year from the date of birth in order to compare it with our parameter values. Again, a quick query just to show you what I mean by that. I've written a query that selects from the actor table, and I'm comparing the year of the date of birth to see if it is in this list of numbers. So if I were to execute that query, it shows me anybody born in the years 68, 78 or 88. So we need to replicate this functionality in our report builder report. Let's head back to the design view of that report, and I'm going to right click on the actors dataset and choose dataset properties. And then I'm going to add another criteria to the end of my where clause. So I can say, and I'll use the year function to calculate the year of the date of birth and check to see if that is in a multi-value parameter whose name I'll make up. I'll call this one at YOB. Then close the round brackets. Okay, so having done that, I can click OK. That generates my new parameter. I'm going to change a couple of quick things here. So I'm going to double click on the year of birth parameter. I'm going to change the data type from text to an integer. It isn't absolutely vital to do this for a query parameter. I've mentioned this in previous videos. You could leave that set as text if you wanted to. If you were using a report parameter and a dataset or table filter, however, you do need to make sure that the data type of the parameter matches the data type of the column you're comparing it with. And even if you're just using query parameters, I think it makes sense to match the data type of the parameter with the data type of the column or expression. You'll notice that that prevents us from allowing a blank value, which is another one of the problems we'll need to overcome, but we'll sort that out shortly. For now, I'm just going to allow multiple values, click OK, and then if I run the report, and I click on the drop-down list and type in some numbers, 1968 and 1978 and 1988, and click View Report, we'll find a list of actors born in any of those 3 years that I've typed in. Now we need to think of a way to include a substitute for nulls so that we can find any actors with no year of birth or no date of birth. That's a little trickier because, as we saw, we're not allowed to include a blank value or an empty string when the data type of the parameter isn't text. So what other substitute values could we potentially use? Well, I guess we can first of all look at the data type returned by this function. So we head back to SQL Server Management Studio. I've got a tooltip popping up when I hover the mouse cursor over the year function that says it returns an int. So it always returns a number or an integer. So if we can identify a whole number, which would not ordinarily appear if we calculated the year of somebody's date of birth, then we could substitute our nulls for that value. I think -1 is a fairly safe bet. We're unlikely to find any actor born in the year -1. So what I'm going to do is say where ISNULL, and then open up some round brackets, the year of the date of birth, type in a comma, -1. And then I can check if that is in the list, 68, 78, and in fact, let me just narrow this down a little bit. I'll go for 1968 or -1. And if I execute the query, I'll find all the actors born in 1968, as well as the one single actor who does not have a year of birth or indeed a date of birth at all. So -1 seems like a sensible value to go for. Let's head back to the report, back to the design view. And then I can first of all modify the where clause in the query. So I can right click my actors dataset and choose dataset properties. Then I can wrap an ISNULL function around the year function. So ISNULL, open some round brackets, year of date of birth, followed by a comma, and then the number -1. And then I can check if that value is in the list of options I've returned in the year of birth parameter. So having done that, I can click OK. And when I run the report, I can click on the drop-down list for year of birth. I can type in -1 and then any other year I like. I'll go for 1978 this time. Click the View Report button and I'll return all the people born in that specific year, but also the one person with no year of birth at all. Now let's create a data set to populate the available values for this drop-down list so that we don't have to carry on typing in the years. Again, I've got a basic query to demonstrate the process we'll go through here. So this one, first of all, just selects the years for the dates of birth for each actor. We get one row for every single actor in the list, and again, we're getting duplicates in this list. So step number 1 is to add the distinct keyword to the select statement, and then that shows us just one entry for each year, 101 rows. Next, we know that we can't include a null, and we've substituted our nulls in the where clause of the actor dataset with -1. So let's do the same thing here. I'm going to say ISNULL year DOB, comma, -1. And then if we execute that, we'll see we get the value -1. That's not a particularly helpful value for our end user to see. So what I'd then like to do is create a label column which displays no date of birth or null date of birth or something else that's obvious and plain English. So let's copy and paste this. And then I'll type in a comma on the next line and paste that in. Change the alias to say birth year label. And then I could attempt to change the -1 to a piece of text which says something like no date of birth or no year of birth, something like that. Anybody who knows anything about data types in SQL Server will be shouting at the monitor at this point saying, no, that's not going to work, and indeed it isn't. The year function returns an integer, and I've tried to replace an integer value, if the integer value is null, with a string or a char value, a varchar value in fact, and I can't mix and match data types like that. So one way to solve this is to wrap the year of the date of birth function in a cast or a convert function. So I could say ISNULL cast year date of birth as varchar, and then close the round brackets. So if I execute that now, it shows me no date of birth, which I can now use as the label field, and then the birth year, which I can use as the value field. So again, rather than typing all that out again in Report Builder, I'm just going to copy all of this to the clipboard and then head back to Report Builder and the design view of the report. I can right click on my movies data source and choose Add Dataset. I'll call this one Year List and then paste in the query I've copied into that box there. I'll click OK to create my new dataset, then head back to the year of birth parameter. I'll just change the prompt so it's a little more readable. I'll call this year of birth, and then head to the available values page, choose to get values from a query, choose the year list dataset, set the value field to birth year and the label field to birth year label. While I'm here, I might as well do the same thing for the default values so that it automatically populates all the results in the report. So I can go to default values, choose to get values from a query, set the dataset to year list and the value field to birth year. I can now click OK and then run the report one more time. And we'll see all the results get returned to begin with, but I can happily uncheck the select all box, check the no date of birth, click view report, and it will return the one actor with a null in the date of birth field. Let's move on and look at the example which allows us to select the country in which a film was made. This one's a little trickier again because the dataset is based on two tables from the database, the film table and the country table. Just to explain what I mean by this, let's have a quick look at another query I've set up in SQL Server Management Studio. This time I'm using the Query Designer just to show you how the tables are related. So the country table has a country ID, which is its primary key, and that primary key value is referenced in a foreign key in the film table. So each film indicates the country it was made in by storing the ID number of that country. If I add this query to my query page by clicking the OK button, I can see that by default it uses something called an inner join. Now we have separate videos which explain all about joins in SQL, but what this basically means is I'm only going to return a result if there is a matching value in the joined fields between those two tables. So as long as the film has a value in the country ID, which appears in the country ID column of the country table, then the result will be displayed. So I can execute the query and see that all the Australian films pop up to the top of the list. If I know much about the way my database works, I know that there are 1,200 films in the film table, but I can see that I'm only returning 1,199 rows here, so there's one film missing. And that's because we're using an inner join. There's one film with no country assigned to it, so it has a null in the country ID column, and there are no nulls in the country ID column of the country table, so that film is not displayed. To get it to appear in the first place, I need to change the type of join I'm using. So in this case, if I want to see all the rows from the film table is situated to the right of the country table in this join statement. So I want to say that the join is a right join or a right outer join if I prefer. The outer keyword is optional. So if I say a right join, that will give me all the rows from the table on the right of that statement. So if I execute that again, I can now see the one missing film with a null in the country column. So I need to create a report which shows that set of data in the first place. I think it makes sense at this point to create a brand new report. So I'm just going to go back to the design view of my actors report and press Ctrl and N to create a brand new report. Feel free to save yours if you like. I'm going to click no, I'm not going to bother. I will add a data source quickly. I'll go through this. I won't explain too much. I'll create a new data source called movies using an embedded connection to SQL Server. Click the build button, type in a shortcut to my local host, and then the name of the instance of SQL Server I'm using, and then select the movies database. Click OK a couple of times. Right click on that data source and choose Add Dataset. Call the dataset Films, and then I can use the query designer to get some basic help constructing it. I'll go to the country table first and include the country field, and then the film table and include the title, the release date, and that will be enough, I think. If I click OK at this point, I'll see that the query that gets generated uses an inner join again. And again, my film table is on the right of the join statement, and I know that I want to return all the results from the table on the right, so I'll change the word inner to the words right outer. Having done that, I can click OK. Get rid of my page footer, get rid of my title text box at the top, insert a new table into the report, insert the title, the release date, and the country fields. Make sure that I'm not going to encounter this font rendering bug when I run the report. Just change the column width of that as well. So I'm going to highlight all the cells in the table, change away from the default font to any other, and then back to the default font. Format the release date. How quickly can we do this? Format the release date, and then change the background color of the header row, and then we're pretty much there. If I just run the report, there's our basic list of results with the one film with no country assigned to it. Now let's add a where clause to our dataset, which will allow us to select the ID of the country in which the film was made. If we head back to the design view, and I can right click on the film's dataset and choose dataset properties, I can click at the end of the select statement, give myself a new line and type in where, and I'll base this on the film country ID field. So I could type this in or copy and paste it, but I'll say film.countryID. It's very important to specify which table your country ID column belongs to in this case, because we've got two country ID fields available in the dataset. You must specify which table this field belongs to. So I'm going to say where film country ID in, and then open some round brackets and make up a new parameter name. Let's call it country ID. Close the round brackets, and then I can click OK. I will just double click on the report parameter that's been created for me. I'll change its data type to an integer because that's the type of the country ID field, and I'll allow multiple values in the drop-down list. Once I've done that, I can click OK, and I can give this a very quick test by running the report. I can click on the drop-down list, and if I can remember any of the ID numbers of any of the countries, I think 240 is the United Kingdom and 241 is the United States. So if I click View Report, it looks like I've guessed correctly. My memory was good enough. Now we just need to think of a sensible substitute value for nulls that we can use to check for films with a null country ID. Again, this requires knowing a little bit about the design of the database. If I switch back to SQL Server Management Studio, I've gone to the design view of my country table and highlighted the country ID column. And in the column properties area, I can find the identity specification section. So I've set up this column to automatically assign a number each time I add an entry to the table. The first number that will be assigned to the very first item added to the table is the number 1, and then it increments by 1 for each new entry. So if I know that, I'll know that I can't possibly have a negative number in the country ID column. So that seems again like a sensible option for a substitute value for nulls. Let's use -1 as our substitute value. I can head back to the report and then back to the design view. We can right-click the film's dataset and choose dataset properties. And then in the where clause, if I zoom in again, I can say ISNULL film.countryID, -1, close the round brackets, and then the -1 will be substituted whenever the country ID is null. So I can click OK, and then I can run the report. I will click on the drop-down list, I'll type in -1, and then 240, and then 241, and then click the View Report button, and we should find that the one film with no country ID now appears at the top of the list. Now let's look at creating a dataset to populate the available values of the drop-down list so that we don't have to carry on guessing what the country IDs are. To make this work, we'll need a dataset that returns the country ID, because that's the value we're comparing in the where clause of the films dataset, and the country name so that we can display that to the end user. We've got a couple of choices for this, but the obvious one might not necessarily be the best approach. I'll just go back to SQL Server Management Studio. Here's a select statement that returns the country ID and country from the country table, and I've unioned that to the value -1 for our substitute null value and the label no country assigned. That seems like a sensible choice, and we've used that technique in a couple of previous videos to add an additional option to a list of values. So we can see I'm seeing the no country assigned label there with -1, and then a list of the countries which have been assigned to films in the film table. However, below that, I've also got a list of countries in the country table which have not ever been used in the film table. I think I pretty much populated this list by copying and pasting a table of countries of the world from a random website, probably Wikipedia. So although I'm sure Zimbabwe has a fascinating and vibrant film-making industry, I haven't put any Zimbabwean films in my database, so it seems fairly pointless including that option in my drop-down list. So perhaps a better approach is to create a query, again, that uses both the country table and the film table so that I can see only the countries that have actually been used and assigned to films. So at the moment I'm showing just the country name, so I've got country.country. I could also include the country ID, so let's say country ID. Sorry, that was meant to be a full stop rather than a comma, but I shall place a comma here as well. You can also see I'm getting duplicate values in this list, so multiple films made in Australia. So again, I'll add the distinct keyword here, so that when I execute this, I get a list of just the countries that have actually been used in my film table. And because I've used a right outer join to include all of the films, I've also got my null value here as well. Now we know that we need to substitute the country ID null with a -1, and we can substitute the country null with a sensible message like no country assigned. So let's replace the country ID first. We'll say ISNULL country.countryID, comma, -1, and then we can assign an alias to that as country ID. So we'll just relabel it with the original column name. For the country column, we can say ISNULL again. And then this time we'll replace this with a message that says something like no country assigned. So we'll give that an alias. Let's call this one something different. Let's call this one country label. And then I'd like to change the order by clause. In fact, I'll need to change the order by clause because I can't reference that column any longer with the distinct keyword. So let's copy the country label alias and place that down there. So when we execute the query at this point, we'll see that we have indeed returned our -1 and no country assigned, but unfortunately it's partway down the list, which isn't particularly helpful for the end user. It'd be nicer if that item floated up to the top of our list. So we could do a couple of basic things here to help our end user. If we didn't want to create another column to sort the results, we could just ensure that this value appears at the top of the list by adding some extra characters so that if this were sorted alphanumerically, the round bracket symbol ensures that this one appears as the first entry. So if I added some round brackets around it, you'll see that alphabetically the round bracket comes before A, so that one now appears at the top of the list. So that is a bit of a cheat way to do it, but it works. A slightly longer-winded way to do this would be to add a separate column. So rather than modifying that nicely formatted bit of text there, we could do something like this. So let's just copy that line and then we'll paste it in on the next line. And this time I just want to replace any nulls in the country column with any other character that would appear before the first item in the list alphabetically. So we could just use a single open round bracket if we wanted to. A 0 also works equally well. And then I could change the name of that column so that it's called sort column or sort field. And then if I copy and paste that to the order by clause, execute the query again, I'll see that the label still looks nice and sensible without the extra characters, but they're sorted alphanumerically based on the value of that substituted 0. Your choice basically, whichever you find easiest or most applicable. I don't want to have to type all that out again, so I'm just going to copy and paste this to my report builder new dataset. So I go back to report builder, head to the design view, right click movies and choose add dataset. I will call this one country list and then paste in all of that code into the query box before clicking OK. Now I can go to the country ID parameter, head to the available values page and choose to get values from a query, choose the country list dataset, the value field will be the country ID and the label field will be the country label. If we wanted to automatically assign all the countries as the default values, we can go to default values, get values from a query, choose country list and choose the country ID for the value field. Okay, so one more click of the OK button and we can run the report. And we should see that all of the columns are selected, all of the countries are selected by default in our drop-down list, but we can also choose individual options from the multi-value list to find all of the results based on the items we've selected. So there we go, a few ways to handle null values in your multi-value parameters. Of course, it's a bit of a cheat, isn't it, really? We're not really using null values. We're substituting the nulls for a replacement value that we can reliably test for in the where clause of our underlying dataset queries. Still, it could be potentially useful. Hope you found it useful. Thanks for watching. See you next time.